David, could I just ask as well for everyone, if possible, to put themselves on mute, please, because there's a little bit of feedback.
Okay.
So if people put themselves on mute until they're speaking. Thank you.
No Chris from Penargroes. I'm going to be there tomorrow in Penargroes. So good to see you from here. Right. Let's get into it then. I say this is an event for you to learn more about the Regulatory Board for Wales and what they're up to. If you're not familiar, and if you're a newbie here, the Regulatory Board for Wales advises the Welsh Government on housing policy and regulation, and examines the performance and activity of Welsh Government and social landlords. But I'm sure they're going to talk about that in more detail now. I'd like just to mention two people. They'll probably introduce themselves in a bit more detail, but there's two people here today. We have Deep Sagar, who's the chair, who's appointed in an open appointment process of Regulatory Board for Wales. Been enrolled about a year or so, Deep, year and a bit. And he provides that leadership and direction for the board and acts as a spokesperson. He's taken part in TPAS events before, and David Lloyd and I have meetings with him to discuss how we can improve things like the tenant voice into the work of RBW. And I was really pleased with our meeting. It was just before Christmas, where we found a lot of common ground on how we could achieve that tenant voice into RBW. And Ian, I'm sure he'll, last time I looked, he was head of regulatory strategy and policy at Welsh Government. I'm sure he'll correct me if I'm not. And Ian is a regular at our events. Many of you have heard from Ian before. We even had him on video. We've had him doing Q&As. And I'm sure, I say, no stranger to us. So if I can maybe turn to Deep and see maybe you'd like to just open and introduce himself. And I think there's somebody else from RBW as well here, isn't there?
Yes, thank you, David. First of all, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, because I do understand on a spring summer's morning, you could be doing so many other things. So I really appreciate that you're here talking to us. It would be wonderful if you comment and ask questions as we go along. So as David mentioned, I'm chair of the Regulatory Board for Wales. I started on the 1st of January 2021. So soon it'll be a year and a half, but still learning. So I think just a few things from me before I will bring in my colleague board member, Hugh Thomas, in a minute. The most important thing to remember is regulation is there for two main purposes. The first one is tenants and customers living in social housing, in housing associations, they are looked after properly. So their housing is fine, their services are fine, and so on. And the second purpose is that the money with housing associations is being used properly. A lot of it is public money. So they have money for tomorrow to look after services, and they're using it properly. And Ian might talk more about that in a minute. The next thing I wanted to say, as David was saying, our main role as the board is to advise the minister or Ian about how regulation has been going, how housing associations are doing. That's broadly our role. So we have to learn about what is happening on the ground, and therefore learning and listening to all of you is very, very important. So we gave our annual report for the last year recently to the minister. That has advice to the minister on various issues. That should be published very soon on the Welsh Government site where housing and regulation related papers are published. So you'll be able to read that, what we said. And the minister has recently sent a reply back. So again, subject to her views and what Ian Boltus say, we could even share that. Okay? The other thing I wanted to say that some weeks ago, the minister asked for a review to happen into our board, what the board should be doing, how it should be working, and so on. The results of that review, we don't know. So we'll get to know soon. So we should be able to tell you after that how the board will function in the future, and so on. So let me now bring Hugh Thomas in, my colleague, to add to what I have said about the board before we hand over to Ian Walters on regulation. So David, if that's okay, Hugh will come in now.
That's great. Yeah, Hugh.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can see me okay. I'm the other board member that's attending today. I've been a board member for about 2 years now, and that 2 years really has been overshadowed, I should say, by the pandemic. I'm yet to actually attend a board meeting in person, although the ways of working these days of the mandatory sort of Teams meetings and so on and so forth have worked very, very well. And I'm based in North Wales, in Anglesey, beautiful sunny Anglesey. I'm a Welsh speaker. I worked for local government for over 30 years. My background is as a chartered environmental health practitioner. So I was responsible for housing enforcement for a great many of those years. So I'm very, very familiar with some of the poor standards in housing, particularly in the private sector over the years, and trying to address that. And to be honest, that is still an issue that's very, very close to my heart. Looking back at the last sort of 12, 18 months, as Deep said, we've obviously had the report to the Minister being produced recently. And my sort of personal reflections on the last sort of 12 months is that, and being a fairly new person as well to RBW, is that the system that we've got in Wales is called co-regulation. And that means there's a joint responsibility between the regulator, which is Welsh Government, and housing associations to make sure that they comply with the various requirements set in place by the Minister. And I think the system that we've had with co-regulation over the last 12, 18 months has proved its worth, to be honest, because of the pandemic. The challenges that have been placed on us by the pandemic has meant that system was able to adapt very, very well to that, and we were able to actually sort of manage quite a few of the actual changes that were implemented because of the pandemic. So regulation was able to carry on in a meaningful way, really. I think from my own perspective, we found the very, very innovative approach of the regulator by, in the actual production of the business continuity surveys. As a board member, I found them particularly useful because, I'm an independent board member. And I need to try and actually satisfy myself that the regulator is regulating adequately. And I think the business continuity surveys in particular were able to provide me with that reassurance that housing associations were continuing to perform as they should. Obviously, many were subject to, majority were subject to extreme challenges and difficulties. But I think, the business continuity survey was showing that things were holding up quite well. Now that we're coming out of the pandemic, hopefully, he says, it's an opportunity to actually take another look at the regulatory framework that we had. And I think it's good now coming out of the pandemic that we're actually thinking about a new system, and obviously that system has now been put into place with a new regulatory framework as of, I think it was January of this year. We're currently in the transitional phase of that before the full implementation. I think Ian might talk a bit more about that later on, and so I think that's a very, very worthwhile thing to mention as something that's happened in the last few months. And I think that's strengthened certain aspects of things like tenant engagement and housing standards and so on and so forth. So again, as an independent board member, it gives me some additional reassurance in that area. I think looking forward, housing standards is an issue that's never far from the forefront of our minds, I think, particularly myself on the board with my background. And I think the pandemic has brought this more into focus in the last two years, particularly with us having spent more time at home. Our ideas of what our home should be has changed. You know, many people are working from home. Many people were confined to their homes for a long time, and you know, the idea of having an amenity area, a garden, is very, very precious to us. I think it's important to say that, you know, you mentioned before about the board advising on policy. That might be the case in that we may suggest certain areas require attention, but it's not the board's role to actually devise that policy. That's Welsh government's role, and I think as an independent board member myself, what I need to make sure of is that I'm satisfied that the regulatory process is in place to make sure that housing standards are maintained. And I believe that is the case. I think that they're looking forward to the next 12 months. I think there's some very important developments that are going to take place shortly as well, which is going to strengthen that even more. We've got some a revision of the Wales housing quality standards that are due fairly shortly, which will build up on some of the lessons learned during the pandemic, I'm told. And I think it's also worth mentioning that we've also got the new fitness for human habitation regulations coming in on the 15th of July, I believe. And again, I think the Wales housing quality standards will take these regulations into account. So I'm sorry if I've gone on a little bit, but hopefully there's a method there, and hopefully that will be of some interest to participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. That's brilliant. And I'll circle back on WHQS and some of those things in a minute. But I'm conscious Ian is here from Welsh Government, from the regulatory policy team. And I'm wondering whether, Ian, you could maybe give us an update from your side before we maybe start having a discussion.
Yeah, thanks, David. Morning, everyone. Glad to be here again. I'm not going to be too long in just giving my brief update, because this is about Meet the Board and talking to the board, and the board listening to what people have got to say. So I think it's worth, though, just reflecting again. As Hugh and Deep have mentioned, we've had a difficult couple of years. During that time, though, we've done quite a lot of things, not least of all was implementing a kind of temporary arrangement and interim regulatory judgments. And as we've moved out of that, as we said, we've launched a new regulatory standards and a new framework in January this year. And I think the important thing there is the increased emphasis, particularly around the tenant aspects of the regulatory standards, and also equality, diversity and inclusion. We've issued three 3, I think, regulatory judgments in the revised format. If you remember, the format changed so that judgments come out now as compliant or non-compliant, and kind of green, yellow, amber and red, a traffic light system suggested by one of the tenants in one of the consultation sessions, which I think has worked really, really well. So the judgments for Pobble Group, Clwyd Allen, United Welsh have been published, and the team are working on the next round of assessments, which will be published in this quarter. We've also published our first ever judgment under review notice for Trevalis. People will have seen that. I'm not going to say any more about that. You know, what we've said is on the public record. We're looking into issues concerning the governance and management of the organisation, and we will issue a new regulatory judgment in due course. I think feedback on the new format report has been pretty positive so far from what people have said to us. Of course, we're always happy to listen to criticism too, and learn from kind of where we're at. But I think whilst the feedback has been positive, it's also worth noting that so far they've all been compliant green judgments, which is the best judgment on offer. I think it'll be interesting if we do, and I hope we don't actually, but if we do get some judgments which are not compliant green, when people see how the improvement requirements are going to be set out very clearly, so that people will know what the issues are that we're concerned about and what we expect the organisations to do about it. I think the feedback there will be interesting, but as I say, my kind of touch wood position is I hope we don't get that means we've got problems to deal with as a regulator. We've also published a number of documents over the last few months. So the Regulation Performance Assurance Report for 2021 is on the website, and that's the report where we provide the board, if you like, with assurance about what we've been doing over the period as a team, about the regulatory performance of the sector in terms of kind of non-standard judgments and things like that. That is on the website at the moment, and that report obviously informs quite heavily the RBW's own report to the Minister, which, as we said, will be published very shortly. We've also published the sector risk overview, which is the first update we've done since February 2020, and that sets out the risks, challenges and high-level expectations for all RSLs to consider in terms of sector-wide risks, if you like. And we also included in there quite a number of kind of think points for organisations which don't have any regulatory status, but they're just questions that we think organisations might help organisations when they're thinking about the sector risks. So I think quite an important document. We published the social housing conditions and disrepair feedback, which again contained a number of think points for organisations, and we've done separate sessions on the conditions and disrepair feedback, and I think we're doing another one with CHC next month. We've also published a criteria and process for voluntary deregistration of RSLs, and that is something that we've been wanting to put in place. We did a consultation on that criteria prior to the pandemic. Quite rightly, we paused that work during the pandemic, but as we've come out of that, so there is now a criteria for RSLs should they wish to deregister. It's not something that we expect to be very common, but we do have a number of very, very small RSLs, former or charities and kind of RSLs that own perhaps one or two properties, which quite frankly can't really meet the requirements of the regulatory framework. But within the deregistration criteria, there are massive safeguards about the organisation and particularly about the tenants of those organisations as they move forward. Very shortly then, moving on to what is coming up, we'll publish the comparative tenant satisfaction data for RSLs and local authorities. That should be within the next 2 weeks, hopefully, but we do have some delays on publishing documents at the moment because the website people are concentrating on publishing guidance and advice for Ukrainian refugees and so on and so forth. So there is a bit of delay with publications. And we'll also be publishing the board diversity feedback report that we do every year very shortly too. So I guess the thing to look at now is what's next for regulation. And Hugh and Deep both mentioned that we're in a transition period, if you like. So firstly, we'll be working towards implementing the next kind of iteration of our regulatory assessment process. At the moment, the transition process is working well, and we will put in place the next iteration when conditions are right. But meanwhile, what we are doing as well is increasing the number of assessments and judgments that we're doing each quarter as the sector and our team get used to the new processes, get used to the new standards, get used to the new judgments, get used to the new self-evaluation requirements. As a team, we've also started to review the official guidance documents which RSLs have to follow. That's a long process, quite frankly, and takes a lot of time to do. But the aim that we've got as a team is to have a very low number of official or statutory guidance, if you like, as low a number of statutory guidance documents as we possibly can at the end of the review. And where we do issue statutory guidance, that actually the guidance adds value to the sector, to RSLs, to tenants, to everybody else. So that is a process that we've started and we're working through, but it is a little bit of a long-term plan. We'll also continue to look at the publication of data and information. Like I said, we're publishing the tenant satisfaction data shortly, and I think people know that what we do is publish local authority tenant satisfaction and RSL tenant satisfaction based on the same set of core questions, so that people can look at their landlord's performance, compare them with other RSLs or compare them with local authorities. We're going to continue to look at where we can publish the same data for all social landlords. And again, the purpose of that is around scrutiny and holding landlords to account. So, you know, I'm not making a particular commitment, but we're looking at things like, so we ask, we collect a lot of data about rent and so on. Can we publish any of that data to compare, so that people can compare things like arrears levels and stuff like that? So we're looking at that sort of thing. And we also continue to think about implications for Wales from some of the initiatives that other housing regulators through the UK are doing. People will have seen the UK government is introducing this social housing regulation bill. We're looking at that and seeing what that actually contains, what it actually means, and whether or not any of that is useful or meaningful for Wales, and we'll make an assessment of that. A lot of that we actually already do in different ways, but it's an interesting exercise, and we can always learn from the other jurisdictions and other initiatives.
Lie down. Go on.
And then I guess the other things that we will be looking at, or one of the other things we'll be looking at, resources permitting, is
Hello? Have I just
to
lost
carry
you?
on the work. Sorry.
Sorry, I thought we lost you for a second there. It might have been me. Sorry.
No. Yeah, we'll be looking at carrying on the work that we've been doing in terms of domain regulation. But I think most importantly, coming out of the pandemic, what we're doing, the team actually, rather than myself, but the team will be returning to a more face-to-face, more in-person meetings, more in-person attending, board meetings and meeting chief executives and staff and others. And I think that's happening over the coming months. So you can expect to see the regulation team more and more kind of back to what people would say is the old way of working. I would say actually it's not the old way of working, because I don't think we can disregard some of the innovative ways of working which we've seen and adapted to over the last couple of years. So I don't think we'll ever go back to that kind of everything is face to face. And you know, the advantages of virtual meetings are we can very easily have Hugh and others in from North Wales, West Wales. Geographically, it works really well. But there are some activities that we do which work much better face to face. So we'll be looking at kind of returning to that to a hybrid system, I guess we're going to call it, as the years go by. So that's a very quick canter through where the team are, what we've been doing. I'll stop there and answer questions and so on.
Yeah, Ian, can I, before we start looking through the comments and stuff, you know, that tenant satisfaction data is a subject dear to my heart, which is great. Where will people find it? Is it on the Welsh Government website? What sort of things would they expect to see in there? So
it's on it'll be published on the Welsh Government website, and we would hope that positive landlords will also publish a link on their website so that people can see that. And what you'll see is there's a series of questions. For example, how satisfied am I with the repairs, with my repairs? And then you'll see the statistics for every single landlord on a bar chart effectively, and you'll see the number who are satisfied, very satisfied, no kind of particular view, and unsatisfied and very unsatisfied. So you'll be able to see very clearly from the graphs, although they're very, very small. I have to say, it's not a perfect system. I need a magnifying glass, that's for sure. But you'll be able to see and compare. So RSL A and B, with local authority kind of Y and Z, and you'll be able to see exactly where your organization is. And I think there's a range of, it's 9 or 10 standard questions that we ask, and we ask every landlord to do a survey and provide us with survey information that is not more than 2 years old. So the survey is relatively current. And this is the first year where every landlord has asked the same questions. If people might be aware that we published a set of data last year, but it wasn't a complete set of data based on the same questions. So we think that data set will get better and more useful as time goes on.
I think that's really important. From my experience in Scotland, a lot of, I can see there's people from scrutiny groups here today. They've used that data to compare the landlord against maybe their local authority that's nearby, or landlords that might be similar to them, and get that feel. So I think it's really important developments, and I look forward to seeing that. And we will do our best to try and communicate that to tenants and things when that goes live. Maybe we'll do a little talk through it or something. So that's good. I've got some more questions, but it's not my session here. So I'm going to turn to maybe some of the things on the side. Amanda, you've said, are there any plans to make that information more readable, in time? Small graphs and things might be an issue for some people. Is that?
Yeah, I think we're very conscious that at the moment as it stands, it's not particularly accessible. We're looking at that constantly, and I'm hoping that we will be able to get a better platform as time goes on, because there is no doubt that the data that is provided, that is published, is extremely useful for those scrutiny purposes, and also for scrutiny by tenants on their landlords, but also by landlords on themselves as well.
Yeah. I am going to come to you, Eleanor, but because you're TPAS, you're going to have to wait as well. Chris Bolton's asked, I don't know if you can see it in the side in there, the business continuity survey is a useful thing. Sorry, it was to Hugh, actually. Did you pick out anything useful or good practice? I know this is a key subject for Chris, which is that sharing of good ideas, good practices to build anything resilient. Is there anything, Hugh, maybe you could comment on?
Obviously, we were keeping a close eye on the various different themes that were in the business continuity surveys, looking at trends and so on and so forth. And obviously, there many housing associations suffered from, people being put on furlough and so on and so forth. And there were some dips in certain aspects of repair and things like that, but that picked up towards the end. That was good to see coming out of the pandemic. Things were improving. So as a board, we were monitoring trends and just looking for any of the outliers really, and really asking the regulatory team, why is this, and so on and so forth, and seeking reassurance from them. So it was a very, very valuable tool during the pandemic. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, I think that is continuing in a form, isn't it, going forward?
Yeah, I mean, as part of regulation going forward, there will be a quarterly regulation survey or regulatory survey. We're still working on what that needs to be asking on the questions, if you like, or on the data that we're collecting, because quite clearly some of the questions we were asking were very pandemic related and not necessarily kind of useful going forward. So we're working through, but Hugh is exactly right. Is what that told us during the pandemic is for example, we were asking about were there, particularly in care settings, was staffing levels safe? And you know, we would want to know that right up front if people were getting close to unsafe staffing levels. So we were able to identify things like that. Interestingly, we were also able to watch the pattern of arrears, because right at the start of the process, everybody, myself included, was thinking arrears is going to fall off a cliff and going to massively increase. And actually what we've seen over the 2-year period is arrears have actually come down, which is just not what anybody forecast at all. And it's been the same across the rest of the UK too. So really, really interesting. But what it did give us the opportunity to do was where a particular RSL was reporting perhaps a lower level of safety compliance, we were able to go and talk to that RSL and say, okay, tell us what's going on, make sure we understand, give us that assurance so that we can give the board that assurance that we're content with where you are, if you like. So extremely useful, and will continue to be extremely useful as we go forward.
Okay, that's good. Alan, sorry, I will come to you now. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to highlight a question in the chat from Nazia about how long will the transition phase be regarding previously regulatory frameworks and new frameworks?
Yes, that's a really good question. So let's be very clear, the framework and the standards is not the transition. The bit that's the transition is the way we do our assessments. So what we've got is a transition assessment model, if you like, which produces a transition judgment. We will then move, when conditions are right, into the full assessment model that we've talked about a number of, I think, TPAS events and other events over the last couple of years, the work that we've done with Campbell Tickell to develop that assessment model. And that is a kind of a program of, and I'll use the English kind of shorthand for it, I'll use our words. So full regulatory assessments periodically, supported by kind of light touch regulatory assessments in the interim. When is that going to happen? I think gone on the record a few times as saying that we hope to do that in the current financial year, that we hope to be transitioning as we come out of this financial year, and that's still the plan.
That's great. I've had an anonymous question here who didn't want to ask it in front of everybody. Is there enough challenge and scrutiny of landlord performance and the decisions by tenants at the moment, as in given the tenants having enough opportunity to challenge, especially as landlords are doing a lot more online during the pandemic? And I've been a big fan of that in terms of the online work. I know we've got Cynefin in the room today. They've won awards for it, and big fan of Cardiff Community as well, some of their online work. But we've had feedback from tenants saying that, you know, they want to return to some face-to-face to allow a bit more in-depth scrutiny to. Do you have any just RBW or?
Yeah, can I come in here, David? Yeah. So I think very good question. So we always keep wondering what is really happening with tenants, okay? How are landlords treating them and so on. So we try and look at various sources of data, okay? So one is, of course, what the regulator tells us. Periodically, they would tell us, like they published the survey that Ian was talking about, how things are going, okay? We've looked at complaints data from the Ombudsman, because that shows that people are still dissatisfied with their association and they've gone to the Ombudsman. We look at other publications like TPAS, Scumry have periodically published, you know, feedback from tenants and customers. Shelter Cymru published feedback. Crisis also told us what is happening. So we are always looking for other sources of information. And in fact, one of our recommendations to the minister this time was that the regulator should consider what else it will consider in detail rather than just looking at the self-evaluation the landlord gives. So I think if you have more suggestions about what we should be seeing that offers challenge to what the landlord is saying, I would welcome that.
Okay, that's a good question, good point, Deep. And that self-evaluation, maybe it's a question to some of the tenants in the room here. The landlords do a self-evaluation, evaluating themselves. Is enough? Have any tenants been involved in scrutinising that self-evaluation, or maybe some of the landlord representatives here could comment in terms of, Melanie, you got your hand up? I don't know if that's a yes you have, or no, you
Yeah,
haven't.
yes, it is. We've consulted with some tenants on the work we've done on the self-evaluation so far, to get their feedback, to see if they think that we're giving fair information. So yeah, we've definitely consulted with tenants on that.
I think that's really important. Is any self-evaluation needs to be, I think, scrutinised and challenged. And I think it's good to see. Excellent.
And I think, David, just to make it very clear, there are certain requirements of the self-evaluation. As you know, we're not prescriptive. We don't tell people how to do the self-evaluation, but what we have set out is some requirements of what the self-evaluation must tell us. And one of those is how have tenants' views been taken into account in this self-evaluation process. So very clearly, again, just saying, tenants' views are really important in this. You can't just give us the board's view. We want to know what tenants think as well. And I think, again, just something I've said often is that if a landlord was to say, well, we've got a board member who is a tenant, so therefore we've met our obligation there, we're saying that's not good enough. You have to do more than
that. I don't know if there's a question anybody will want to answer, but we've got a question in the comments from Rob, which is around, do you envisage amalgamation of smaller housing associations? Because bigger isn't always better. And I totally agree with you, Rob. When I look at some of the super housing associations, 190,000 homes in England and stuff, it gives me great concern that you can lose a bit of focus. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, as it was raised.
Yeah, David, can I just attempt that? Very good question again. Okay. I think we as a board have not considered that question, whether there should be advice on this or not. But we are aware that, especially in England, lots of amalgamations have happened, and different kinds of data are available. What we did tell the minister in our last annual report is that it should be considered how money could be better used by housing associations. So that's where we are. But so again, if you had views like this one, we would welcome your telling us whether amalgamations are working or not working.
Richard,
I think.
Sorry,
sorry, I was just gonna say that Welsh government doesn't have a policy of pursuing amalgamations or mergers, but if amalgamations or mergers are the right answers for organisations in terms of value for money and all sorts of other things, then we will support organisations in achieving their aims.
Richard, I noticed your hand shot up as we were talking about the subject, so I'm that it's related to this subject.
Yeah, it's my own personal view. I think we put too much emphasis on mergers and amalgamations. That the real conversation is about value and about how organisations working collaboratively can jointly provide value. And there's some really, really good examples of it happening. So if you look at, for example, there's a joint procurement exercise going on at the moment. There are 17 organisations involved in that joint procurement, 11 retained local housing authorities and 6 housing associations on standardised design for MMC, for example. And that in its own right, then we would like, or we are expecting to lead to additional value for money, not only in terms of reducing our cost base, but improving better homes, more energy efficient homes, better sense of place for people to live going forward. So I think the sector holistically just needs to learn from where it gets things right and build upon some of that, rather than this sort of, like, in my view, kind of antiquated view that if you merge, you save your cost base. And there is some, you see some good examples in local authorities, for example, where they jointly commission services. For example, I know Cardiff and the Vale, and in fact I think Vale and Bridgend have some consolidated services, but there's no impetus really for those organisations to merge. So I think the challenge for us, and I know that organisations like United Welsh and Pobble, who are in the room, have an open door policy really for entertaining those kind of conversations and seeing whether we can deliver better value collaboratively on whatever it is we need to focus on.
I think you're right, and that it's coming out in the comments here about cooperation and co-production. I think we've got a great, proud history of that in Wales. I've been surprised even on things like Rented Homes Act, the amount of collaboration that we've been facilitating and swapping our ideas. I've been really impressed with it, and I think decarb challenges and stuff like that can only come from people collaborating. And
and I think the marker goes, you know, it goes beyond just housing associations working together. You know, we run a leadership program which we have kind of developed with Henley Business School, and you know, we've had people from Vision 21, I think we've got someone from Taipal attending that, so that, you know, that kind of relationship just goes broader than the housing associations. Again, it's just, you know, the kind of direction of travel of the sector and just trying to improve, you know, holistically what we want to do.
Okay. Before I go to some more comments, I want to chuck in a question to RBW and Ian, because it's been kicking around for a bit now, and that's the issue of regulation domain and whether local authorities should be covered under the regulatory department. It is in other places, it's not here in Wales at the moment. Is there any current position on that? Because it's been rumoured for a while now. And
I think, David, before my time and before Hugh's time, previous annual report of the regulatory board had made some sort of recommendation to the minister that local authority social housing could be considered for so-called domain regulation. So the same regulators looking at housing associations and that. We ourselves have not said anything because we think we need to know much more before making such a serious recommendation. And I think Ian will tell you they've been doing some work to get some more data.
So is there anything else to add to that, Ian? Or is that...
Yeah, well, I would only add to that really is that the minister is very interested in looking at so-called, as I mentioned in my piece, so-called domain regulation, only for the tenant services aspects of local authorities and RSLs, and seeing if there are any benefits to putting them under the same or closer alignment of the kind of the oversight regulation, if you will, of the two sectors. If that work is to move forward, then there needs to be far more research done and development done, because quite clearly there's no point in pursuing anything around that, you know, if it's not going to deliver benefits for tenants. And I think the jury at the moment is very much out on that, and there will be some plan of work around it, resources permitting, as we move forward. But having said all of that, the work that we're doing in terms of the publication of data, as I said, we're looking at, obviously we've got the comparative data with local authorities and RSLs on tenant satisfaction, and we're looking at where we can do more of that kind of comparative data across the piece. So that's not a substitute for so-called domain regulation, but it's a step in the kind of direction of making sure that all social landlords publish data, and we publish data that gives some better accountability for tenants.
That's great. Going back to the original comments, there's a number of people saying they found the new process works well. I think that was Nick and Richard. It was also pleasing to see, I think it was Alison and someone from Newydd saying that their tenants do scrutinise the self-assessment, which was good to see as well. Can the team help me out? Is there anything else I've missed in the questions at the moment?
Yeah, David, there's a question from Chris Bolton. It's the question for Hugh. Hugh mentioned the business continuity survey as a useful thing. Did it pick out useful things or good practice that could be shared to help build our resilience for any future events? That's a question from Chris.
I thought we'd done that one, actually.
Yeah, I think we did answer that one.
Fine. Okay. Thank you.
David, there's a question on the tenant panel. Shall I try and answer that just now?
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah.
So there's a question. Let me see who was asked.
Alison.
From Alison, saying, will the board look to seek direct assurance from tenants? Will there be a tenant panel still via TPAS Cymru? I think, again, a very good question, because until some years ago, the board had the help of a tenant advisory panel, which finished. And then after that, the main source of information on tenants, customers' issues has been TPAS Cymru or the regulator. So we are thinking about it, and we would say this route is by and large working well, okay? Because, for example, in a recent meeting with TPAS Cymru, we were told that many customers thought that their housing associations were not even publishing their self-evaluation document. That is a breach of the code that applies. So that's a very serious breach, and somebody who sees that should be going to Ian Walters or his team and complaining. That shouldn't be happening. Yeah. We also know that a couple of housing consultants have approached the Welsh government to see if there should be an independent tenant's voice. So they're talking to the Welsh government, talking to TPAS Cymru, and we'll watch all that. So again, your ideas whether we need more tenants' voices, customers' voices, they're welcome.
Yeah. And I would add to that, as TPAS Cymru, our board discussed this last week about a form of tenant council, and we've got some ideas on that, and we discussed it with the Welsh government briefly last week, and we're going to take some further up conversations on this. I think there is a feeling that there's something we could do, like anything. Sometimes it's about funding, you know, and if you're going to pay travel and things like that, who's going to pay it, and hotels and stuff. But no, we're aware of that ourselves, Alison, and certainly our board at TPAS have got ideas on that. We'd like to. Some of that's behind conversations at the moment, behind doors, but I'm hoping in time something will come of that. Yeah, it's good. Suzanne Jones made a comment there about rural tenants not having access to the internet, which holds them back. In what way, Suzanne? Is that about getting involved or attending stuff? We all know, yeah, the issues of digital can also imply work prospects as well and things like that. If you haven't got,
yeah, they get excluded. We're trying for an inclusion, not an exclusion. And a lot of the older people don't understand it, and the rest have no internet at all. And mine's intermittent, which is why I keep flicking in and out.
Yeah, and I think that's a good opportunity. Sorry.
Yeah, David, just to say, I think, again, a very important point. Sometimes we might forget, you know, because we get used to these virtual panels and doing this stuff digitally. So what helps the board in particular is we have a tenant or a customer inside the board. One of the members who hasn't unfortunately been able to come today. And we also want to travel to all parts of Wales and meet people. So I and Hugh and Ian go to conferences, and we encourage. And then towards the end of today, we'll give you our email address, and we'll encourage anybody who's interested. Just please contact us and tell us what you feel, what you want to know, you know, how things are going.
The thing I would add to that is the Welsh Housing Quality Standards, the new consultation came out yesterday, I believe, and we're going to be running some events soon on this. And I think broadband and things like that is something, you know, is that something that should be in the standards? Is rural connectivity should be in the standards? Yeah.
Yeah, it is in the standards.
Yeah.
Quite ambitious standards, actually.
And I think that's, we're running some events. I just want to pull that up, actually, just so people are aware. Sorry, I had a few things today to talk about. Yes, on this date, I don't know if you can see that. We're going to be running some events. Oh, I don't know what's going on there, but you might be able to see that. There's some dates there for consultations we want to run with tenants and staff. And there's just more information on our website if you wish to attend that. I think I'm back in the room. Yeah. So we'll just go back to the agenda then for a second, and let's have a look at. We talked about regulation, recent developments. Is everyone clear on their future work plans in terms of what RBW are looking for going forward? I think we've talked about a number of things today. We've had some questions about feedback and concerns. And I guess the next bit is about that performance. We've talked about the new regulatory framework. Is there anything anyone else wants to ask or raise? No. Okay.
David, sorry, David, there is one question here, another question from Richard, I think. Beg you, sorry, yeah. I'm sorry, it's from Chris Bolton, asking whether the RBW have got any thoughts on the impact of the building safety bill, and will it change the focus of regulation, or will it mostly sit with people like building control?
So I think, sorry, Deep, I'm going to just step in before the board do there, and just to make it very clear that the building safety bill introduces a new regulatory regime for building safety, which is outside of, but will have connections with kind of the social housing regulatory function too, but very much its own regulatory function, primarily because it covers far wider properties and buildings than just social housing.
Yes,
and it will, you know, a different regime effectively.
Yeah, so I think that is useful. And also what is coming in July, as you mentioned, there is a new provision that every landlord has to make sure that through the tenure of the tenancy, they are providing good condition of the rental property. That is critical. So we will keep watching this. So we were quite concerned some months ago, for example, when there were news out of the Shelter Cymru survey, and TPAS Cymru as well told us that many customers thought that they had damp and mold in their building, and those things were not being catered for quite quickly. And the recent condition survey that Ian talked about, some damp and mold issues were mentioned there as well. So again, we will watch this. Again, we're not experts, but whatever you tell us, we will see. And Hugh particularly has a background in terms of, safety and other issues. So hopefully we'd be able to comment if necessary.
That's good. That's good. Okay. I think I just want to mention a couple of things while we see if there's any last questions. I just want to mention, obviously, a couple of things coming up. This is part of that tenant voice that will feed into Welsh Government and their thinking. So I'm just going to switch that around. There's a survey out at the moment on Tenant Pulse. I think 250 of you have already filled it in the last 48 hours. And that's looking about energy, net zero, and attitudes to that. I'd really encourage tenants of any tenure, council, any type of social private rental to fill that in. It's a great response straight away in the last 48 hours. I mentioned the WHQS consultation. Real good opportunity to understand what's in that consultation and give your views on it. I also want to mention, we haven't talked about it today because it's not part of regulation, but decarb and that retrofit is going to be one of the biggest things, I think, over the next 10 years to affect tenants' homes. And we've got a great week coming up for that. Also, David Lloyd would kill me if I didn't mention the Good Practice Awards that we have, but also keep an eye out because there's a number of things. Like next week, we've got an interesting session around passports. And we've realized that people don't really know what that is. And I think that's going to impact a lot of how we track homes, give transparency to tenants in the future. And as I said, I'd really recommend having a look at our program to see what else is there coming up, the things that might interest you. And we've also got Facebook groups. I think I've mentioned before, we've been surprised how popular some of these are and how well they work. Different groups for different audiences. And we'll be developing some new tenant experience ones around net zero, retrofit, things like that coming up. So I hope that makes sense. and stop sharing. Come back to see what other comments.
Oh, can you just leave that page on a minute? I'm trying to write those down.
All right, okay, I can see it.
Thank you.
If you search on Facebook for TPAS Cymru, you'll see the groups under our main page. But I can, yeah. Is that okay? You got them, Amy? Was it Amy? Yeah.
Yeah, thank
I'll
you.
send you this afterwards if you want as well, if that helps. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So are we back in the room now? No. So yeah, oh yeah, the team are helpfully putting some of those links on the side as well. So I hope you find this useful. Is there any final remarks anyone wants to, our speakers want to say? Or
I think from my side, David, I'd like to thank you, TPAS Cymru, and everybody here today for talking to us, listening to us. All of this is very, very valuable. And remember, as I said, one of the two main objectives of regulation is that tenants and customers get looked after. So if anybody wants to talk to us, communicate with us, an email address can be put in the chat, David. It's housingregulation@gov.wales. Just put RBW on that. The communication will come to us. If anyone for any reason wants to talk confidentially, I would suggest go to David Wilton or his colleagues. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And by all means, even my email address can be shared with anyone who's interested. But I would just say, remember, we can't do anything about an individual case. That's not our role. Our role is to advise the government. So if you can tell us something more about conditions which might be reflected in your case, yes, definitely those things will help us. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you for that, Deep. And I would recommend to say if people want to come through TPAS, sometimes navigating Welsh Government websites can be challenging in terms of finding names and things like that. So do come to us and we can point you in the right direction and help you with that as well. Helen, sorry, you've got your hand
David,
up.
I've got an anonymous question here. I'm not sure if it's something that can be answered, but the question is, would a landlord be allowed to impose the cost of treating damp and mould on tenants? We don't know whether that's...
I'm not sure that's for this forum, but I think it's an interesting subject, and we've got some events coming up on damp and mould. We've been running a number with landlords and tenants recently, so I'll take that away. Promise if it's anonymous, I'm not sure who to go back to, but if anyone wants to let us know confidentially, anyway, I'm certainly glad to have a chat to you about that subject.
Yeah, I know who that person is. David.
Right, okay, I can go through you, Helen, then. Yeah, lovely. I'm going to, unless there's anything more, I would thank our speakers today. Deep, Ian has been great, you know, all of them today, all your contributions as well. Hugh's contribution, it's been a really useful session, so thank you. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Sun's breaking over Cardiff finally, so yeah. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, John's comment. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Deep.